There are a few of you here who have heard this presentation or parts of it before, and I do apologize. And I thank you all for coming very much, and I thank you for giving me a chance to talk about my favorite subject. All right. It's good to be back at school. I've actually been writing this memoir for a long time. I suspect that many of you in this room are writing memoirs in your head, and you may one day put it to paper, and it may never get into print, as I wasn't sure mine would ever, but it's a good experience, and I encourage you on. And what I tried to do in the little book was to capture some things that I thought would be useful, and some things that I thought would be interesting. And I mainly wanted to reach people who might not have read, and probably didn't read, the more academic books that I did with Yale Press. People like stories, people like memoirs. There's special sections in bookstores now for memoirs, and so it's becoming pretty common. And so I thought I'd take my hand at it, and that story that had been germinating around in my head for so long, I did put it to paper. I want to tell you a little bit about the memoir first, because I know that there's not quite as many copies back there as there are people in the room, so this may be all you ever hear about it. And secondly, it will sort of introduce the subjects that I'll be talking about a little more. So I'll go through the book a little bit, but I also want you to know that after that, what I want to really talk about is the links between the emergence of the environmental movement, as we have seen it in recent decades, and the civil rights movement, and the potential still today for links between the two. And so I will take those themes up, and I'll also, if I have a moment, I'll look ahead to how the environmental community today is responding to some of the challenges that I talk about in the book. I'm not going to do a reading, as I have done in some other occasions, but I may read a couple of paragraphs here and there to make some points. So the book is short. I hope it's funny in part, and it's terribly serious in part also, particularly the chapters about the civil rights struggle. People ask about the title, Angels by the River, and let me read you the first paragraph of the preface, which will give you some sense of the background to the book. I went into these woods to find myself and to retrace some of the life I've lived, accounting for it along the way. I wanted to explore what became of the youngster born in the Deep South in 1942, and what became of the causes that he pursued. And I sought to recapture a time and a place now drifting away, and to recall the people who have been the angels along the river of my life. And the book really is a song about the wonderful people I've had a chance to live with and work with, and colleagues and friends and family. And that's the greatest thing of all. I'll begin by talking about growing up in this very segregated, thoroughly segregated southern town, rural town in the so-called low country of South Carolina. It was 70 to 80% black population, and the Brown decision came down in 1954 calling for integration. When I graduated from high school in 1960, everything was still thoroughly segregated. There's been no movement on any of these issues in this town. And it's also a story, I think, in a way that to me, it's the most moving part of the book, because I have a chance to reflect on what it was like to grow up in this town and to have extensive contacts, black and white, and friends, and it was idyllic in every way except for this racial divide, which was severe, and I didn't realize how ugly, how unjust, how totally unfair and demeaning it really was, until I went up north to school and got out of that environment and went to Yale. And so the second chapter is about getting my head bashed around a bit at Yale, literally and figuratively, to come to see the light, really, on what Jim Crow really was, and how we had to do away with it as swiftly as possible. And I talk about next the sort of story of what happened in this little town of Orangeburg, South Carolina, during the Civil Rights Revolution, and how the town, despite some efforts that many people were making and some minor contributions by me to move this, the moderates into action on integration of schools and other things, and better opportunities for the black community, how none progress wasn't made. So it didn't extend, as I mentioned, nothing had happened by 1960 when I left, nothing had happened by 1968, when the real big wave of the civil rights movement was beginning to ebb a bit. And Orangeburg was pressed at that point to integrate the bowling alley, which is where the big demonstration took place, and didn't. And the town, what happened was the black students at South Carolina State College, predominantly black school, started demonstrating again, as they had many times before. But this time, they had the state troopers who were there to sort of contain the demonstration, which was overwhelmingly nonviolent and non-threatening, nevertheless opened fire on the State College students and killed 3 of them. Shot them with buckshot intended to kill deer, and some rifles, and wounded about 28 others. And this became known as the Orangeburg Massacre. And it just reflects a town that was, so attractive in some ways, but unwilling and unable to respond to the new movement in the country, and to its own black people in the community. And with the result, we had this horrendous slaughter of people. And the town, and I go on and talk about what has happened since. And it's a story of a town that has never had a truth and reconciliation process, and how divided and how much this is still an open sore in the town. So that's the kind of hard part of the book, and I do talk about the way these issues have continued into the present, into our current divides on the civil rights issue. And the fact that our school systems in the country are just about as segregated as de facto today as they were in 1968. And the tragedies of racism that persist in our society. I did leave that part of life and those issues behind a bit. Melissa talked about the resume, which she didn't go into, but I have a rather long chapter on the resume in which I try to poke a little fun at what seems like an ideal resume in a lot of ways, one really good job after another. And I do describe how many times I was turned down for things, and how many twists and turns there are in life. So we should never really give up. The first job I ever applied for when I was clerking for the court, the court, was the Children's Defense Fund. And I thought I'd be irresistible, Yale law graduate and Supreme Court clerk. They turned me down. There has been a lot of that in my life, and it just is something to keep in mind how contingent things are and how things could have been different. If I hadn't gone to Yale where I got my head bashed around, I would have, I was aimed to go to MIT, and if I'd gone to MIT, I'd probably ended up being a scientist and had a totally different life. And the only reason I went to Yale was because they gave me a bigger scholarship. Life is just full of these things, and I try to poke some fun at the resume and a chapter that I had the most fun writing. I then talk about the environmental issues, the way that we came together in 1970 to launch the Natural Resources Defense Council, the background of that, kind of the origin story of one of our great environmental groups today. And then later, in the early 80s, launching the World Resources Institute, another one of our great groups, and how those things happened, and how the people came together, and how we were able to raise the funds to do it, and what our aspirations were at that time, what we thought we were going to be able to accomplish, and how, and I'll talk in a moment about how we were really heirs to the spirit of the 60s, and how we were, in a sense, an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. And so the next chapter then deals with what happened. And I look back over this period of 40-some odd years and look at what happened to American environmentalism in that period. And it's entitled, Environmentalism at the Crossroads, because the thesis that I've developed here and in my earlier books is that we are winning a lot of battles in the environmental community, environmental movement, but we're losing the planet. And so we have to ask why. How do we keep getting stronger with more members and more sophistication and bigger budgets and larger organizations and still find ourselves on the cusp of leaving a ruined planet to our children and grandchildren? And so I try to explain that and to seek to understand it and to seek to suggest ideas for dealing with it. Where do we go if not there? And that has led some to characterize my current views as radical. And I argue in the book that maybe by some standards prevailing in Washington today, they might be thought of as radical, but I don't think that they're truly radical, and I go discussing those issues a bit. And then the last chapter is entitled Some Things I Think I've Learned, and I reflect on life and some things I think I've learned in the process of this very short chapter. I think perhaps because I haven't learned a great deal. I hope in the process I've tried to tell some amusing stories and some interesting incidents, and like the time that they tried to, the group that became the plumbers in the Watergate scandal, tried earlier when they weren't really the plumbers yet, but they tried to stop NRDC from getting a tax exemption and turned down our request for a tax exemption in 1970. And years later, we found in the Nixon library a memo that had been written to him by the plumbers, and it said we should stop giving these tax exemptions to these liberal groups. And they really wanted to get Daniel Ellsberg and some of the real radicals, but we were the first people to walk through the door requesting a tax exemption. So they denied it to little NRDC. And the memo in the Nixon library has Nixon's handwriting on the top, and it says something like, "I agree, go get them." And so they went out and they went fishing and went hunting, and the first thing they shot was NRDC. Needless to say, we challenged that decision, and politically, we were going to challenge it legally, but we won by challenging politically in the first instance. So let me talk to you a little bit about the civil rights background, and I will read a little bit that will give you a sense of what I'm talking about. This is referring to the group of us that came together to start NRDC. We were, after all, children of the 60s. Our Yale group had entered college as the civil rights movement was in full swing. We became anti-war as the U.S. troops in Vietnam escalated. Though unfortunately all male, we were glad to see the birth of the National Organization for Women in 1966. And though we were not hippies or dropouts, we shared much of the counterculture critique of American society. Those of us who started in RDC in 1970 shared the 1960s sense of hope and the desire to bring about serious change in American society. We had studied the civil rights litigation and other important cases, and we knew the importance of the law and good lawyering in the public interest. We had seen the impact of the civil rights movement and other social movements, of citizens standing up and speaking out. And we knew from the civil rights legislation that our government in Washington could do great things, in addition to getting us into great wars. And indeed, the government was essential if great things were to be done. The civil rights movement in the 1960s had taught us that activism could succeed, that government could succeed. And that was, the civil rights movement was our model. It was our inspiration. It was the thing that we had grown up with and had cut our teeth studying and learning about. And we wanted to emulate, in a way, what had been accomplished in the civil rights movement. And it was reflected in my personal life. I had the issue impacted me in a personal way that I will try to explain. I described what happened at Yale when I was confronted by others there and challenged on what was going on back in my hometown and in my state and in my South. And it was painful to conclude, as I had done at Yale, that I and my family and my community had accepted and perpetuated a monstrous injustice towards African Americans, and that the great bulk of what I had come to believe in Orangeburg was nonsense or worse. Yet, when one's worldview and the institutions one believes in collapse, it can be, I found, entirely liberating. It dawned on me, free to see things anew, to form my own views about what was important, and develop a fresh take on the world, unencumbered by any cultural or family inheritance. It was not wise, I had learned, to uncritically accept the status quo. I realized that I had, thank goodness, sidled away from the wrong side of history, and that I never wanted to get close to it again. As a boy, I had accepted one grave injustice, and I was determined not to let that happen a second time. So this encounter with the race issue and having to deal with it was something that I think in my personal life predisposed me to want to take up a challenge for social justice. And when the environmental movement or when environmental possibility presented itself to us in the late 1960s, it came not as a stranger. And so I think the other important thing that happened to me personally was that I was on the train one time going into New York on what was then called the New Haven Railroad and is now called Metro North, known and loved by all as Metro North. And I was reading the New York Times, and I read a story about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, bringing some important civil rights litigation. And I kept reading, and I encountered a story about some environmental issue. This would have been in 1968. The word environment at that point was hardly used as we use it today as the environment, but it was probably the movement of the story about the movement of the National Environmental Policy Act in the Congress, which became law in late 1969. Well, we're all, many of us are lawyers, right? So we're trained to think in analogies, and it occurred to me sitting there on the train wow, what we need is an NAACP legal defense fund for the environment. And so I went back to Yale and started gathering my buddies together and asking them, do you want to make a run at this? You want to create this public interest law firm for the environment? And everybody I asked agreed to do it. I mean, I had my selected group of friends, right? They're crazies. And, but off we went. And it took a couple of years. But in the end of the day, we had funding from the Ford Foundation to create the Natural Resources Defense Council. So it's, again, I think, a lesson that, you know, if your heart is in something, go for it. Get yourself ahead of the curve and try to make it work. And, you know, sometimes it will. But it was a sense of being powerfully influenced in the multiple ways by the civil rights movement. And not me, but I think all of us in that era. And so then we have to confront the great tragedy, right? The great tragedy is that we got our organizations together and we helped to launch this movement for the environment and for environmental protection. And we were as white as the driven snow of Vermont. There was hardly any racial diversity in our midst, and there really wasn't much gender diversity either at that point. And you know, what a tragedy to have been so powerfully influenced by the civil rights movement, by the black people in the United States of America, and then to go marching off into our cause and not have made a powerful effort to reach out to the black community, to the civil rights movement. We didn't. And I think it was also true that the black community wasn't rushing to get into the environmental area either at that point. It was only later when Robert Bullock and others started focusing on environmental justice and writing about pollution discrimination and other issues that we began to see movement. We still haven't seen enough, but at least people are trying now in a way that they weren't earlier. There's another interesting parallel that I've come across really more recently than the memoir. And I want to share it with you because I think it's quite instructive. The background is that, you know, for those of us who have been working in the environmental area for over 4 decades now and have seen so much of what we wanted to accomplish not accomplished, and feeling a sense that we have been swimming upstream against a river that's much more powerful than we are. And the fact that if we really want to turn the situation around, to start making the kind of progress that we should be making to leave an environment sustained and whole for our grandchildren, that we're going to have to tackle some deeper issues. We're going to have to go after the underlying drivers of deterioration and destruction and rapaciousness, and not deal with just the effects of this pollutant and that pollutant, whether they're big or small or toxic or whatever. And so a lot of us have come to the conclusion that, you know, the real issue is that we're up against a system that doesn't give, that's programmed to give bad results for people, bad results for the planet, and bad results for the places that we inhabit and live in. And so if we really want to make progress, we have to change the system. It's an operating system that is programmed for things other than those priorities. I like to say that it's really programmed for profit, corporate profit. It's programmed for economic growth as measured by GDP, and it's programmed for the projection of national power around the world. And it does pretty good on those things. Not as good as some might hope, but it is a system that's not programmed for people and place and planet, and we need to reprogram it. And so a lot of my books, including some in this memoir, talk about the changes that we need to make to accomplish that, those systemic transformations that are required. And so, in a way, I think if we go back historically, we see that there were, people did talk about those deep systemic transformations in the late 1960s and early 70s. The environmental literature of the era in which environmentalism was created was full of calls to transcend GDP, to transcend our consumerism, to recognize that with growth inevitably limited if we want to protect the environment, we were going to have to redistribute resources to take care of poverty at home and abroad. I mean, and in Barry Commoner's case, the most popular book of the era, Our Closing Circle, Commoner asked, is environmental protection, is that consistent with the continuation of capitalism? And his answer was, no, we need a new system. We need something beyond this rapacious, ruthless capitalism that we have today. Well, this was all in the late 60s, early 70s, in which The Growth came out, sold over 1 billion copies around the world. So it was a moment of real ferment about what needed to happen. And I tell the story in the memoir about how we sort of lost that legacy, those roots. The radical roots of American environmentalism were not sustained. We moved away from that. And so here's the interesting part to me, an additional interesting part to that. I was reading a book review, in the Nation magazine of a book by Glenda Gilmore. And the title of the book was Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights. You may see where I'm going with this. And the review makes the following points. It talks about Dr. King's efforts late in his life to return to the radical roots of the civil rights movement and to focus on economic justice and economic oppression and militarism. And the review says, in truth, the civil rights struggle was, from its creation, a much more radical proposition than simply, trying to fight for the end of segregation. As historians have illuminated, much of the world of civil rights activism posed a direct challenge to the traditional structures and systems of American capitalism. At its core, the movement aimed not simply to remove trappings of racial segregation and discrimination, but also to eliminate the economic injustices that had continued to control the lives of African Americans in the aftermath of slavery. And so this book is really a call to recapture the radical roots of the civil rights movement. And what I've been writing about now for several years is the need to recapture the radical roots of the environmental movement. And I think we can draw sort of two lessons from these parallels. One lesson is, boy, the system is really going to rein you in and tame you if you give it half a chance. And that has happened to the civil rights movement, and it's happened to the environmental movement. More interesting, probably, for our purposes, is that this parallelism, the need to rediscover the radical roots of both of these movements, and where those radical roots are saying really the same thing, that we need to change the system. That provides, I think, a basis for a new dialogue, a refreshment, an engagement between the environmental community and the black community in our country. And so I think it's another thing that can begin a discussion. And we're both communities, at least let's put it this way, there are people in both communities that are trying to do the same thing, to rediscover those radical roots. And as I said, and at that level, these roots are both are pointing in the same directions, to deeper systemic changes that can create a system that is really supportive and sustaining of human and natural communities. So that's really the main point I wanted to make coming out of the memoir. The other thing I thought I would mention to you is that I have, for some years now, been preaching to my friends in the mainline environmental community, to NRDC, and where I'm an honorary trustee. That's what you get when they want to stick you upstairs and not hear too much from you. And I say that facetiously. We've convened special meetings at some of these environmental organizations, the so-called Big Green, the main environmental groups, and we've discussed these ideas that I asked, well, what's an environmental issue? And the traditional answer, and in their strategic plan, the answer looks very much like it did in 1970. It's air pollution, water pollution, natural areas conservation, climate change, biodiversity protection. Oh yes, those are environmental issues. But what if an environmental issue is whatever is determining environmental outcomes, whatever is affecting powerfully our prospects for success in sustaining this world for future generations? And once you reframe the answer that way, well, then you see right away that, well, it's our failing democracy that's at the root of so much of this. If we, just look at Washington. It's an object lesson, but it's been true for a long time. We've had this creeping corporatocracy, creeping plutocracy, threatening real democracy, the ascendancy of money power over people power, and that's an environmental issue. Because if we don't do something about that, you're never going to win. Make incremental changes, but we won't do what we need to do. And what about this vast social injustice in the country? We have like 40% of the families low income with no more than 150% above the poverty level. They're below 150% of the poverty level. We have about half the families living paycheck to paycheck now. The bottom falling out of the middle class. Inequality back up to levels that we haven't seen since the 20s. Poverty at an all-time high in terms of numbers. A lot of crummy jobs being created, more than the crummy jobs that were being created earlier. But wages haven't gone up appreciably in decades. So, when you have a country that is so on the edge of economic security, and so such a vast economic insecurity, well, Mitch McConnell, when you make the climate proposal, he just says it's going to hurt the economy, it'll cost us jobs, it'll slow wage growth, it'll raise prices, and people, union people and other people are scared by these proposals and these claims. And so so this is an environmental issue. This vast social economic insecurity in the country is a critical environmental issue. And what about us and our consumerism, our affluenza, our get it and spend it, shop till you drop? You don't have to go far to really see this. It's a little muted in good old Vermont and the Upper Valley, and but you know, it's a rampant it's a disease out in the country and for much of the world now, and that's surely an environmental issue. I mean, our lifestyles, our values, are surely an environmental issue, and so. But these are not things that are high on the agenda of our main environmental groups. They really don't want to, it's somebody else's issues. They are not things they feel comfortable with, or have expertise on, and they have other reasons in some cases for not raising these issues. And so what we have is a huge area of environmental a huge set of environmental issues which are not being addressed by environmentalists. And they have to figure out a way to do it. So I've been making these preachments to my friends in the environmental community and hoping for a response. And the bottom line is I don't get much of one. They have not really moved to occupy the space. So I say to them, you know, what you do is wonderful. We would not be in good shape at all if you didn't do what you did do, and you didn't win the victories that you have won. But it's what you don't do that is going to do us in the end. But I don't get much response. And I'll keep trying. You should help if you want to. But it's been quite interesting. I thought and it's not just me, but I thought all of us who are saying these things would would find a bigger audience and a more responsive movement in the main organized environmental community. But I don't see it. I don't see much of it now. They're getting a little more into the political arena, but the real embrace of pro-democratic political reforms, the real embrace of electoral politics, and I mean, look at the difference between the environmental community, what they've done in politics, and what the Tea Party did. And you know, like the Tea Party or not like them, they became a powerful political force in short order. A powerful political force, still are, and environmentalists are nowhere near that in terms of political clout, in terms of getting involved in the process and being effective in Washington. So thank you. I've had a good time talking to you, as I hope you can see. And I'm happy to answer questions. We have I don't know how long, but I'm happy to stay here and answer questions about any of this, or hear your comments and contributions about these issues. Thank you.
So we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, and we'll just open it up and you can take them.
Or comments or criticisms or, yeah.
You talked about literally getting your head knocked around while at Yale and during the civil rights movement. Could you kind of divulge what happened? And also, in that respect, going forward with the environmental movement, should we get our heads knocked around and be adversary to the status quo?
Well, you know, it's getting knocked around in two entirely different ways. I discuss in the book what happened shortly after I arrived at Yale. I was sitting in a study hall, little study room, and a couple of obviously upperclassmen came to the door and stuck their head in and said, "Would you come here a second?" in a kind of lively voice. And I stepped out of the room, and as soon as I did, they both grabbed me and slammed me and my head up against the wall, and said something to the effect, you know, we know you come from this racist place, and if we hear any of that shit out of you, you know, we're going to come back, and you'll hear from us. I said, oh my God. So it made me really think. That in 100 conversations as a little freshman at Yale, it really shook me up. I cannot then or now recall anything that I did to cause the incident, except being who I was and having an accent or whatever that I did. Something, you know, they took it upon themselves to take me on as a case, and I needed it, and it did make me think, and I thank them really in a way now, and so then I think that I was, one of my regrets that I talk about in the book was, although I did some things, particularly in Orangeburg, to promote immigration into town, and some things to promote civil rights generally, I never got into the movement, and I regret that. I mean, I was never a movement person in the civil rights movement, and I was still struggling with the sort of virulently anti-South attitudes of a lot of the people, white South attitudes of the people I was working with. And a lot of the time at Yale, I was still sort of carrying the torch for the South and saying, you know, yes, we've got to integrate, we've got to do all these things, we can't hesitate on them any longer, but we ought to do it in a way that encourages the communities to stay together, or to do it in a way that encourages the whites, moderates in these communities to come out and take the lead and do it themselves, and that's going to be so much better. And there was this sort of this dream of a biracial South, and a lot of people wrote about it, and I, you know, eventually saw that as this wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen that way. So I left that behind also. The model of Selma, of community agreements, taking risks and suffering even bodily harm to accomplish something that is basic, is something that I think we would do well to learn from the civil rights movement today. And I didn't get bashed up when I was arrested in front of the White House, but I did spend 3 days in the central cell block of the DC jail, and in a pretty unpleasant situation, but we knew we were going to get out. It might be 3 days, it might be 4 days. We knew we were going to walk out. They would open that door, and there were about 60 of us who got arrested that day. And we knew we were going to walk. But one day, the last day, they brought us down in the morning and put us in these huge holding cells under the DC courthouse, and in leg irons, all of us. And what I saw was, you know, hundreds of young black men moving through this so-called system of criminal justice. And I knew we were going to walk, and indeed, late in the afternoon, close the business, they opened the door, and we just walked. We never saw any judge, we were never charged with anything, we never paid any fines, we just were kept in jail for 3 days and walked out into the sunlight. And those young people were still in there. And so I think there are a lot of, you know, there's a powerful lesson we can learn in terms of protest, in terms of demonstration, in terms of nonviolence, civil disobedience today from what the black community did in the civil rights movement. What else? Yes.
Thank you for speaking, and I have a question. You spoke on the big greens, and I was wondering if you could make a comment on greenwashing and the effects within the environmental movement with correlation of some of these environmental leaders holding six-figure salaries, and how that affects our radicalism with this preservation of self. And also, one other question in relation to that is some of these big greens are receiving funding from the Koch brothers or Standard Oil, and so does that limit us as a movement?
Well, I think I have written an essay. It's actually a book review on sort of the way that protest and radicalism are contained in our society, and it's on the Tellus Institute website somewhere, and I think that it's real. On the other hand, I think we have to look at different parts of the environmental community and ask different questions about them. People jump all over the Nature Conservancy, which now has $1 billion a year budget. And there are other groups like the Nature Conservancy. And for as long as I can remember, going way back decades, that's been their thing. They were the place where corporations and wealthy individuals who didn't want to get involved in the policy issues but wanted to do something positive for the environment could put their money. And that's how they get $1 billion plus a year. And so that, there's really hard, in a way, there shouldn't be much expectation that these groups would do the more radical things, or even the policy things. And I think the president of the Nature Conservancy who really built it up is famous for saying, tainted money, tain't enough. And so you have to look at the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund, and others, and form your judgments based on what are legitimate expectations are. People can have different expectations, but historically it's been that kind of place. You can then look at some of the membership organizations that are advocacy groups, and ask questions about them. Are some of them pulling their punches? Are some of their boards getting too corporatized? Is that having an inhibiting influence on what they can do? And I think there is some of that. I've been on the NRDC board, and I think that their biggest constraint is not that. It's the drive, natural and historically embedded, really, to be effective in the current system. And as the system gets worse and worse, as Washington surely has, as I say in the memoir, it forces you to be tamer, to try to get what you can out of it. So, on the climate issue, I think NRDC has been quite effective in helping Obama move these new climate regulations along. So you have to form a judgment about how you feel about these climate regulations. Well, take them all together, they do about, I read somewhere, about half of what the Waxman, Markey bill did that passed the House. So, they're pretty modest. It's a pretty modest step. But, what's he trying to do? He's trying to use a 1970 law because it's the only thing available. And so, people rejoice that we're finally doing something. We have to admit it's not nearly enough. But that need to be effective within the system, which has been, the goal of our main environmental groups, really. And as I say, the system gets worse, and they have to, keep their noses clean. So, a lot of it gets back to changing our politics, I think. Yeah. What else? Yes?
So I'm sitting in the back row, and it pops into my mind that it sounds like your Achilles heel is that you're a reasonable man, and that the Tea Party is representative as creationists and others who have managed to sink pitons well into the wall are unreasonable. And so maybe it's time to be a little less reasonable.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I often quote, you can always find something in George Bernard Shaw to quote me. And his statement was, all progress is made by being unreasonable, or something like that. And I think it's time for a huge amount of civic unreasonableness. I think we need to be very demanding, very aggressive, and a lot of us need to be very uncompromising and outspoken. And I think I went to jail with Bill McKibben, and I'd go there again. I think he's one of our great leaders who is being unreasonable. I mean, he says things like 80% of the proven fossil reserves has got to stay in the ground. Yeah. I mean, to the average ear, and certainly the industry and the power that be in our country, that is totally unreasonable. And yet, it's beginning to develop a following. I mean, cachet is beginning to pick up some steam. It's not viewed as totally crazy anymore by a lot of people. So, figure out how we can be more unreasonable. What else? Yes?
Well, along that same line, it occurs to me that one of the things that is sort of slows things down is this constant pressure from some congressmen that there is no problem with climate change. And so it just always seems like that's such a headache that just as the movement starts to move somewhere, then they say, oh, there's no real climate change. And I don't know if there's a way that the movement just can write people off through that voice, or how to address that voice.
Well, it is encouraging in a modest way. What just happened yesterday or the day before in the Senate, where they're trying to pass the legislation to authorize the Keystone Pipeline, and amendments were introduced to one of them said that climate change is real. So they took a vote. And it passed. It only had one dissenting vote on climate change is real. And I think another one was introduced that said something like climate change is caused mostly by people. And that one didn't get enough to pass, as I recall. But it's it's a great tragedy. When we started this the current era, so to speak, of environmentalism in the 70s, it was very bipartisan. And I really would love to see, a bipartisan consensus again. And people like Howard Baker and John Sherman Cooper, Republicans, were leaders with Senator Muskie in writing the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and all of that. But it's gotten, since that time, it's grown steadily more partisan, to the point that a majority of Republicans in both houses are now on record as being climate skeptics or deniers or worse. And it is, it's just a huge barrier. You have the Hastert rule in the House, where the Speaker agrees not to bring anything to the floor that doesn't have a majority of his party behind it. So right there, you stopped movement in the House, and in the Senate, you have Rule 22 on the filibuster, which effectively stops things there for both parties often enough. So it's I think as I said, I think the answer to so many of our questions is to get get political, to get into electoral politics, to start building up candidates, from city councils to the state house. It's going to take some time, but to work on some pro-democracy reforms that can, over time, change our politics. In the meanwhile, what we've got is opportunities to do things locally. We often have political systems at the local level and the state level where we can move things. And so we ought to be doing as much of that as we can. And indeed, there's actually a lot of that going on in the country. Yeah.
So I don't know if you've sort of noticed this about but I feel like there's this sort of ideology that's being sort of spewed by the mainstream status quo, which is pretty much that climate change is happening. We're not going to admit humans are causing it, but it's happening. It's going to be this huge crisis, but it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Everything's going to go. People are going to descend into chaos, and basically the only solution we have is to go to space. And that's I feel the mainstream idea right now, is that there's nothing we can do. And I feel the biggest the saddest part of that is that it's basically causing people to lose hope, and also to think of each other as I can't work with this person to solve a problem, So I feel there's so much human capital, there's so much human minds, right, that are basically being wasted, if you think of all the black men you saw in prison, right, that's human capital, those minds, if you said you gave them the opportunities, right, to be able to understand these problems, I feel they could definitely be solved, Yeah. But I just feel the establishment is creating this belief in, especially the young people. I'm 28, but I'm talking about the younger ones, 21, 18, those kids. They're creating this belief in them that there's no chance for you, so just keep going deeper and deeper into consumerism and the illusion of luxury and all of these things, and having 6 or 7 cars. Believe that, and then when the time comes, it's the military will just take care of it pretty much. But just but there's this encouragement of this selfish attitude, and I feel that's a detriment to the environmental movement, because they're basically creating this mass of people that's saying there's no reason to fight for the environment. There's no point, because everything's
Well, there's just so much sort of mythology and ideology out there,
Yeah.
As you were saying, and it does work to perpetuate the status quo and to keep us in the current sort of matrix that we're in. So when there's just anybody who's followed the issues at all, knows that there are tons of things that we could do. We're not lacking in answers. We're lacking in politics. But there's also, even a lot of those people who can see that there are lots of things we could do, on climate and other issues if we just would, are pretty committed to the current systems because they think there really isn't an alternative. And indeed, Margaret Thatcher kind of became famous for this acronym. There is no alternative, and she's and they meant that basically there is no alternative to the current system of this version of capitalism that we have, and so what we're trying to do is to organize an effort to open a discussion in our country about the fact that there are alternatives to the current system, that we actually know a good bit about them and how they might work. They're not old-fashioned socialism. They're certainly not the rapacious, ruthless capitalism that we have. And so we've created something called the Next System Project to explore the reality and to legitimize discussion about moving to the next system. We got into this system, but we can move to another one. And so we are doing some research and publishing. We're not very far along with that, but we're beginning to collect materials. We've created something called the Next System Project. It's based at the Democracy Collaborative at the University of Maryland. And we attend, we've had a couple of conferences, and we wrote a short statement, a page and a half. And it basically, says when you have problems emerging across the whole front of national life, politically, economically, socially, environmentally, it can't be due to small reasons. It's due to something big is wrong. And we have systemic problems, we have to change the system. And it's, I think, a pretty elegant statement, about a page and a half. And we started circulating it around for signatures. And it's amazing who has signed so far. I mean, it's not, John Boehner, to say the least. But it is a, former president of the American Political Science Association, former president of the American Sociological Association, former president of the, existing president of the American Management Institute. I mean, it just, I think I've got that name right. But now we have about 200 signatures from prominent individuals who are all sort of saying, yes, we need to begin as a country and as a world to explore systems, alternative systems to the one we have now that look beyond this. And they will involve different power arrangements, a different type of corporation coming along and growing in strength and number, and basically, changes along a dozen different important dimensions. And so we've got this thing going. I hope we'll succeed in starting something, in starting a conversation, which is all we're trying to do now. So that is done in the spirit of hope, as you say. It's not done in the spirit of despair. I love a little phrase that a guy named, what was the name? I forget, anyhow, he said, things are much too bad for pessimism. Bill.
I'm much more optimistic than a lot of people in the environmental movement. I've been there since I was a teenager. I'm really disgusted sometimes about how the big groups fight each other and then take credit and then.
Oh, the credit game is ferocious, isn't it?
It's unbelievable. I mean, you can look at your inbox and calculate when the Sierra Club request for money will come after patting themselves on the back, and I'm a life member, so. But the media is not reporting on a lot of incredibly good news, and I'm a advisor to the president. I was traveling around with Lisa Jackson, and for her last EPA speech, she spoke to 2,000 inner city kids in Washington who really felt they had no hope at all. And we did this as part of this DC Environmental Film Festival, which I'm trying to get you to come to. And she said, you know, you study math, science, engineering, and you can do anything. You can make any amount of money. And you could hear a pin drop. But she was talking about green jobs and the new technologies, which are creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, soon to be millions of jobs. Oil is going to be utterly of the past. If you talk to Les Brown, he says there are days in which in Germany and Ireland, think of Ireland, where half of all their power is produced by alternatives. Ireland. So not reported by the media. And fast forward to Podesta in China and that deal, which was pretty good. And I just wonder what you think about any of those points.
No, I think there is a lot of good news, and there's a lot of bad news. And I think neither one of them get reported very well in the media. I mean, we could have 400,000 people marching down the streets of New York, all kinds of people, very diverse, raising all kinds of issues, but centered around the climate issue and climate justice, and it barely gets reported in the media. And on the other hand, there are, as you point out, there are positive developments that are not getting reported either. I mean, for a long time, I just watched Brian Williams at night to see what they're going to say. I've already learned most of the news by that time anyhow, but I just would like to see what they're going to say. Up until very, very recently, they would not say anything about the climate issue. You know, the NBC Evening News just wouldn't talk about it, and finally they were, you know, they I think owned the Weather Channel, so they would invite some Weather Channel person to comment on the latest disaster, and he or she would say, well, you know, this Arctic ridge is coming down, and the jet stream has done this or whatever, but never any kind of possibility of a climate link. And so it's changed now a little bit, so that's been a modest step in the right direction. But I think there's a huge deficit in the coverage of all of these issues, the good things and the bad things. And newsrooms are being cut back. The environment reporters, in particular, are being cut back. The programs are, and you know, we're more and more dependent on sort of independent news sources to bring things out. Yeah, and yeah, I agree I love Lisa Jackson also. Okay, what else? We're running out of time here.
We're gonna have to end this right now so people can get to classes, but if you have any time for staying after, there might be people who want to chat with you. And the representative from the bookstore is just about to leave, so if you want a book, you're gonna have to grab her now or go to the bookstore later. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.